Ask why Iran and America hate each other, and almost everyone gives you the same answer. 1979, the revolution, the embassy, the hostages, 444 days. That answer is wrong. Not invented, just late. 1979 is chapter 2. The story starts 26 years earlier, and the students who climbed that embassy wall knew exactly which date they were answering. August 19th, 1953. The day Britain and America killed a democracy to keep its oil. Every conflict has a first domino. Not a cause, not a grievance. A moment. The instant before which one future was still possible, and after which it wasn't. For everything you have watched happen in the Middle East since, the hostage crisis, the sanctions, the proxy wars, the nuclear negotiations that collapse and restart and collapse again, this is that moment. On that day, in a hot and dusty capital 8,000 kilometers from Washington, a small team of foreign intelligence officers removed the elected prime minister of a sovereign country. They did it with cash, with rented newspapers, with hired crowds, with a 50-page psychological profile of a frightened young king. The entire operation cost roughly $1 million. And here is the part that should stop you. The two countries that ran that operation were Britain and the United States. The two loudest voices in the 20th century for the rule of law, for self-determination, for the right of a people to choose their own government. They chose that government's replacement themselves, because the elected one had done something unforgivable. He had decided that his country's oil belonged to his country. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory. I want to be very clear about that. For 60 years, this was denied, dismissed, called Soviet propaganda. Then, in 2013, the Central Intelligence Agency declassified its own internal history of the operation and admitted, in its own words, that the coup was carried out as an act of U.S. foreign policy, conceived and approved at the highest levels of government. So, this isn't a story about what might have happened. It's a story about what did, and about a bill that the world has been paying ever since. To understand how 4 days in August could reshape a century, we have to go back, not to 1953, to a signature on a piece of paper in 1901, in a man who wanted to be rich. His name was William Knox Darcy, an Englishman who had already made one fortune in Australian gold and wanted a second one underground. In 1901, he sat down with the court of the Shah of Persia, a dynasty deep in debt, run by men who understood palaces better than geology, and he made them an offer: £20,000 in cash, £20,000 in company shares, and 16% of the annual net profits. In exchange, Darcy received the exclusive right to search for, drill, refine, transport, and sell every drop of oil and gas across 1,242,000 square kilometers of Persian territory. Let that number sit for a second. That is roughly 3/4 of the country, an area the size of South Africa, signed away for 60 years, tax-free, by men who had no idea what was underneath it. For 7 years, nothing. Dry hole after dry hole. Darcy nearly went bankrupt. Then, at 4 in the morning on the 26th of May, 1908, at a place called Masjid Soleiman, the drill hit something. A column of oil went 15 meters into the air. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company was born the following year. Today, you know it by a different name. 2 letters. BP. But oil is only money until somebody makes it strategy. And the man who did that was Winston Churchill. In 1911, Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty, and he had a problem. The Royal Navy ran on coal, British coal, reliable, domestic, and slow. Oil was faster. Oil-fired ships accelerated harder, refueled at sea, needed a fraction of the crew in the boiler room. Converting the fleet to oil was the difference between catching the German Navy and watching it escape. There was only one catch. Britain had no oil. So in 1914, weeks before the First World War began, the British government did something extraordinary. It bought 51% of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. Overnight, a private commercial venture became an arm of the British state. And from that moment, Persian oil was not a business asset, it was a national security asset, which meant the internal politics of Iran were now, permanently, a British concern.
And if you want to know what that arrangement actually looked like on the ground, not in the boardroom, but in the dirt, you go to Abadan. Abadan held the largest oil refinery on Earth, and it was two cities stacked on top of each other. On one side, the British Quarter. Lawns, cinemas, tennis courts, swimming pools, clubs with air conditioning, in a place where summer temperatures pass 50 degrees Celsius. Rose gardens, watered daily, in a desert. On the other side, a short walk away, lived the Iranian workers. They called their neighborhood Kagazabad, Paper City. Not because of paper, because their homes were built from flattened, rusted oil drums, hammered flat and nailed together. In summer, those metal boxes turned into ovens. In winter, the streets ran with mud that came up to the knee. No running water, no electricity, wages of around 50 cents a day. No sick leave, no holiday pay, no compensation if the refinery took your hand. The company's own defenders said the Iranians were lucky to have the jobs. Now, here is the statistic that broke Iran's patience. In 1947, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company posted after-tax profits of £40 million. Iran's share that year was $7 million. And this is the detail that Iranians repeated to each other like a wound. In some years, the British government collected more in taxes from the company than the Iranian government received in royalties from its own oil. A foreign treasury earning more from Persian oil than Persia did. Meanwhile, across the Gulf, something had changed. In 1950, the Americans in Saudi Arabia signed a 50-50 deal, half the profits to the host country. Iranians read those headlines, and they did the arithmetic. They asked London for the same terms. London said no. And that no put a 68-year-old lawyer in the Prime Minister's office, a man the British would come to describe in cables as a lunatic. He was nothing of the kind. Mohammad Mossadegh was born in 1882 into the Iranian elite. His father was a finance minister. His mother was descended from the Qajar royal family. He grew up inside the machine of the state. Then he did something unusual for a man of his class. He left and he studied. Sciences Po in Paris, then a doctorate in law from the University of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, the first Iranian ever to earn a European PhD in law. He came home with a weapon almost nobody in the region had. He could argue with Europeans inside European legal logic, in their own vocabulary, better than they could. And he was, by any measure, a genuinely strange man. He wept at the podium, openly, mid-speech. He fainted during debates, sometimes from illness, sometimes, his enemies said, from theater, and he never bothered to explain which. He conducted affairs of state from his bed, in pajamas, an iron cot in his own home, receiving ambassadors and generals from under a blanket while foreign dignitaries stood at the foot of the bed in their good suits. Western newspapers found this hilarious. They ran cartoons. They called him the weeping prime minister, the old man in his nightshirt. They were laughing at the man who was about to take the British Empire's single most valuable overseas asset away from it. Because underneath the pajamas was the sharpest constitutional lawyer in the Middle East, and he had noticed something. The oil agreement had been renegotiated in 1933 under Reza Shah, the previous king, installed with British acquiescence, later pushed out by the British and Soviets during the Second World War. Mossadegh's argument was simple and lethal. A contract signed under duress by a government that was not free does not bind a nation that later becomes free. Not, we want more money. The deal itself was never legitimate. In March of 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The vote was unanimous. On the 28th of April, that same parliament elected Mossadegh prime minister by 79 votes to 12. For the first time in the modern history of the region, a country had taken back its own resources by law. Not by revolution, not by force, by a vote in a parliament following its own constitution. Time magazine named him Man of the Year.
Iran celebrated for about 3 weeks. Then the reply arrived. Britain's response was not a lawsuit. It was a siege. British technicians were withdrawn, thousands of them, and forbidden to train replacements. Britain declared that anyone buying Iranian oil was buying stolen property, and warned tanker owners they'd be sued in every port on Earth. The Royal Navy moved into the Persian Gulf and intercepted shipments. Exports from the world's largest refinery fell to almost nothing. Britain froze Iranian assets in British banks, blocked Iran's access to hard currency, and banned exports of key goods to Iran, including sugar and steel. Iran had oil it could not sell, a refinery it could not staff, and a treasury going empty by the month. And notice what Britain never seriously offered: 50-50. The terms the Americans had already given Saudi Arabia, because this was never only about money. Read the British cables of the period and you find something older than economics, a conviction that this oil was theirs. British engineers had found it. British capital had drilled it. The fact that it happened to lie under someone else's country was, to the imperial mind, a geographical accident. The empire was ending everywhere. India, gone. And now a lawyer in a nightshirt was doing to British oil what Gandhi had done to British India. So London decided that Mossadegh had to go. There was just one problem with that plan. To make it work, Britain needed America. And America, at first, said no. Harry Truman had no appetite for this. His administration saw the Iranian dispute for what it was: a colonial company that had squeezed a poor country for 50 years and was now shocked to be told no. The Americans applied pressure on both sides, sent mediators, pushed London toward a settlement. And Truman refused to sign off on removing a foreign government to save British commercial profits. So Britain lost that argument. And then, Britain won the calendar. In November of 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was elected. In January of '53, a new administration walked into Washington, and with it, two brothers. John Foster Dulles became Secretary of State. His brother, Allen Dulles, became Director of Central Intelligence. Foreign policy and covert action run by two men who shared a surname, a worldview, and a dinner table. And this is where British intelligence did the most consequential thing in the entire story. Not a bribe, not an assassination, a rewrite. They stopped talking about oil. Every British briefing to Washington had, until then, been an argument about property, contracts, and compensation. Now the vocabulary changed completely. Mossadegh was no longer a nationalist with a legal case. He was unstable, erratic, losing control. And Iran, a country with a 2,000-kilometer border with the Soviet Union, was, they warned, weeks or months from falling to communism. For an administration that had just watched China turn communist and was fighting in Korea, this was the one sentence guaranteed to get a yes. And it worked. Now here's the part of this story that has never stopped being absurd. Mossadegh was not a communist. He was not sympathetic to communists. He was a wealthy, aristocratic landowner with a Swiss law degree and a deep faith in constitutional procedure. Iran's Communist Party, the Tudeh, spent years attacking him as a bourgeois, as a servant of the elite, as a Western liberal. He banned their newspapers. He broke up their demonstrations. He did not trust them, and they did not trust him. If you had designed a man specifically to be a barrier against a communist Iran, you would have designed Mossadegh. But by then the machine was running, and the machine had only one gear. Once a country enters the Cold War filing system, the local facts stop mattering. There are two folders, ours and theirs, and if you are not clearly in the first, you get filed in the second, whatever you actually believe. In the spring of 1953, President Eisenhower authorized it. The British called their version Operation Boot. The Americans gave theirs a cleaner name, TPAJAX. And in July, a grandson of an American president crossed the Iranian border under a false name. On the 19th of July, 1953, a man calling himself James Lockridge entered Iran. His real name was Kermit Roosevelt Jr., grandson of Theodore Roosevelt. Harvard-educated, 37 years old, and the head of the CIA's Near East operations. He set up in a basement in Tehran with a budget of around $1 million, in a country where, at the time, that could buy an enormous amount of anything, including people. The operation had 3 pillars, and it is worth understanding each one because every regime change operation for the next 50 years would be built from the same 3 parts. Pillar 1. Manufacture the reality. The first target was not the government. It was the truth. CIA and MI6 assets went to work on the Tehran press. By the agency's own accounting, a substantial share of Tehran's newspapers were, in some form, purchasable. And they were purchased. Editors on retainer, journalists paid per article, cartoonists paid per drawing. Then the stories started. Mossadegh is a secret communist. Mossadegh is a Jew. Mossadegh is an atheist plotting against Islam. Mossadegh is planning to abolish the monarchy and hand the country to Moscow. None of it was true. All of it was everywhere. And there was a second layer, which is the darkest professional detail in this entire operation. Agents attacked religious figures in mosques while posing as Mossadegh's supporters. Fake attacks, real fear. A prime minister blamed for violence organized by the people trying to remove him. This is 70 years before your feed. Same architecture, slower delivery. Pillar 2. Rent the street. The second pillar was chaos you can hire. Tehran had a particular resource, organized street muscle. Neighborhood gangs, bazaar enforcers, professional wrestlers from the traditional gymnasiums. Men who could put hundreds of bodies on a street on a few hours' notice. They were bought. And so, in some cases, were clerics, men with pulpits capable of turning a Friday sermon into a political instruction. What Iranians saw in those weeks was a country coming apart. Pro-communist mobs one day, anti-communist mobs the next. Some of them the exact same men, paid by the same source, working from opposite scripts. The goal wasn't to convince anybody of anything. The goal was to make the country feel ungovernable, so that when the army finally stepped in, it would look like rescue. Pillar 3. Break the king. The third pillar was the hardest because it required nerve from a man who had none. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was 33. He had been placed on the throne by foreign powers in 1941 after they removed his father. He knew exactly what he was, and it made him permanently, visibly afraid. The plan needed him to sign 2 royal decrees, one dismissing Mossadegh, one appointing General Fazlollah Zahedi in his place. He refused. Then he hesitated. Then he asked for guarantees. Then he refused again. It took weeks, including a visit from his own sister, and a message relayed with an American accent that made unmistakably clear which 2 governments were asking. In mid-August, he signed. The night it failed. Late on the 15th of August, the commander of the Imperial Guard drove to Mossadegh's residence to deliver the dismissal decree. He was expecting a resignation. Instead, he was arrested on the doorstep. Mossadegh had been warned. The plot had leaked, through talkative officers, through two-day contacts inside the army. Loyal units were awake and waiting. By morning, Tehran radio was announcing that a coup attempt against the government had failed. And the Shah did what the Shah did. He got into a small plane with his wife, flew to Baghdad, and then on to Rome. When reporters found him in a hotel there, he had almost no luggage, and he told them he would probably have to look for work. In Washington, it was over. The operation had blown. The asset had fled the country. On the 18th of August, headquarters sent Roosevelt a cable telling him, in effect, to stop and get out. And here is where the history of the modern Middle East turns on a single man's decision to ignore an order. Roosevelt did not leave. He later claimed he simply chose not to act on the instruction. Whatever the internal wording, the effect was the same. With the plan officially dead, he spent the next 36 hours restarting it. His assets fed the Tehran press, a version of events in which the Shah had lawfully dismissed the prime minister, and Mossadegh was the one defying the constitution. Copies of the royal decree, the very document Mossadegh had rejected, were printed and distributed across the city. The story flipped. Overnight, the prime minister became the usurper. On the morning of the 19th of August, the crowds came out. Some were paid. Some were genuinely angry at weeks of chaos. Some were royalists who needed no encouragement at all. By midday, the mob had grown far beyond anything $1 million could purchase. And that is precisely why it worked. Bought crowds became real crowds. Then the army chose a side. Military units joined the marchers. Tanks moved on the prime minister's residence. The fighting there lasted hours. Estimates of the dead across those days generally run in the range of 200 to 300 people. By evening, Mossadegh's house had been overrun and looted. He escaped over a garden wall. The next day, he surrendered. General Zahedi took the prime minister's office. Within days, the Shah flew home from Rome, from a man looking for work to an absolute monarch in under a week. Kermit Roosevelt went back to Washington and briefed the president personally. One thing worth saying plainly, historians still argue about the exact weight of each hand here. Some emphasize the CIA and MI6 as the decisive authors. Others argue Iranian actors, royalist officers, clerics, and the court drove more of the outcome than the agency's own triumphant memoirs admitted. What is no longer in dispute is that the operation existed, that it was funded and directed from Washington and London, and that without it, Mossadegh very likely finishes his term. The West had its oil back and its king on the throne. It thought the story was over. It had, in fact, just started a clock. Mossadegh was put before a military tribunal and charged with treason for refusing an order from a king who, at that moment, was in a hotel in Rome. He used the trial exactly as you would expect a lawyer to use it. He turned the dock into a lectern and gave a defense that Iranians quoted for decades, that his only crime was to nationalize his country's oil industry and to end foreign control of Iranian affairs. In December of 1953, he was sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement. He served them. Then he was sent to his village at Ahmadabad and kept under house arrest, watched, until he died of cancer in March of 1967. The government refused him a public funeral. He was buried inside his own house. The oil. In 1954, the settlement arrived. On paper, Iran kept its nationalized oil company and a 50-50 split. In practice, an international consortium took over production, refining, transport, and sales. British Petroleum, 40%. Royal Dutch Shell, 14%, the French, 6%, and 40%, 5 American companies, 8% each. That is the accounting entry for this entire operation. Before 1953, the United States had no share of Iranian oil. Afterwards, 40%. Iran had, in the end, nationalized its oil and lost control of it in the same motion. The police state. The Shah had learned something in August of '53. Not that he was strong, that he had been weak and had almost lost everything. He never intended to feel that way again. In March of 1957, with American and later Israeli assistance in training and organization, Iran created a new domestic intelligence service, SAVAK. Over the next 22 years, it became the most feared institution in the country. Censorship of the press, networks of informers in universities, in ministries, in the bazaar, political prisoners, and torture that was documented repeatedly by international human rights organizations through the 1970s. Now follow the logic of what that does to a society. Liberal parties, banned. Nationalist politicians, jailed, exiled, silenced. The communist left, crushed. Independent press, gone. Free elections, theater. Every legal, secular, constitutional route for an Iranian to disagree with his government was welded shut. But dissent does not evaporate because you outlaw it. It relocates. And there was exactly one space in Iran that even Savak could not fully occupy: the mosque. You cannot arrest a Friday sermon. You cannot ban a religious network that is 1,000 years old and embedded in every neighborhood in the country. So when the explosion came, it did not come from the parties the West would have preferred. Those parties no longer existed. In 1979, the Shah, sick, isolated, and by then hated by nearly every class in Iranian society, fled the country. The revolution that replaced him was the one force the police state had never been able to dismantle. There is a word intelligence officers use for this, their word, not mine: blowback. The unintended, delayed consequences of a covert operation, landing on the country that ran it, years later, on people who have no idea why. And here is the moment where the line becomes impossible to miss. In November of 1979, students seized the American embassy in Tehran and held its staff for 444 days. Why the embassy? Why that building specifically? Because Iranians knew what had been run out of that compound in 1953. The trigger was the news that the deposed Shah had been admitted to the United States, and the fear, stated openly by the people who climbed those walls, was that America was about to do it again, restore him again, the way it had before. They were not reacting to abstract ideology. They were reacting to a memory, a specific one, with a date on it. And this is the shape of the whole thing. In 1953, Britain and the United States solved a problem. A cheap, fast, clean solution. $1 million, 4 days, no American casualties, oil flowing again by the following year. By any short-term measure, a spectacular success. It was studied. It became a template. Guatemala, the following year, used the same playbook. And the bill for that success has been arriving for 70 years. A 26-year dictatorship, a revolution, 444 days of hostages, decades of mutual hatred between two states, sanctions, proxy wars, a nuclear standoff that every American president since has inherited and none has closed. 1953 did not cause all of that on its own. History is never that clean. But it is the point where a different Iran stopped being possible. A constitutional, oil-owning, parliamentary Iran with an aging lawyer at its head, arguing with the West in courtrooms instead of in proxy wars. That country was available. In 1951, it actually existed. And it was ended deliberately by two governments that had told the world that self-determination was the whole point. Empires don't usually fall because someone defeats them. They fall because they keep choosing the cheap solution, and the cheap solution keeps coming due. The men who ran Operation Ajax retired with honors. They died before the invoice arrived. Everybody else is still paying it. If this changed how you see the news coming out of that part of the world, that's the whole reason this channel exists. We take the events everybody references and nobody explains, and we go all the way back to the first domino. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next one continues directly from here. 1954, Guatemala. The same agency, the same playbook, the same man in some of the same rooms, and a country that is still living in the aftermath. Hit like if you made it this far. It genuinely decides whether videos like this get shown to anyone. And tell me in the comments, was there a point in this story where a different decision could have changed everything? 1901? 1914? 1951? Or was it already too late, the moment the oil came out of the ground? I read them all. See you in the next one.